You're listening to Black Agenda Radio. I'm Margaret Kimberley. Elias Amare is a journalist and editor at Horn of Africa TV. He joins us from Oakland, California, to talk about Eritrean festivals which take place throughout Europe, the U.S., and Canada, wherever there are Eritrean communities. These celebrations of Eritrean history and culture have been marred by sometimes violent disruptions. We will discuss the cause of these disturbances against the Eritrean community. So I had the privilege of attending the festival in the U.S. Near Seattle, Washington in early August, which was quite a wonderful experience. But towards the end, there were people who came uninvited, who created a disturbance, who destroyed property. But in some of these festivals in Europe, it was even worse. I guess you could say riots and arrests and injuries. So tell our listeners about how these festivals, which have such a positive purpose of bringing the Eritrean diaspora together, sharing their culture with others outside of their community, how have they become the focus of these violent attacks?
To begin with, these festivals have a long tradition spanning over, say, 5 decades, over almost 50 years. So wherever Eritreans are, they gather every year to celebrate their culture, their unity, and the important ties that bind us to the homeland. This is what keeps us going in exile, in the diaspora. You know, for decades, this has been going on in a peaceful manner, attracting many friends for Eritrea, clarifying the issues of Eritrean struggle, why Eritrea has been sanctioned, why the relentless hostilities and demonization against the country. Most mainstream Eritreans are maybe non-political, but the cultural aspect of these festivals is very important. We are an African people. Without music, without dance, our soul is not nourished. Law-abiding citizens doing all the hard work by themselves, raising the funds to organize these festivities. But in recent times, there has been a relentless attack against Eritrean culture and Eritrean identity, to try to intimidate Eritrean communities from organizing themselves, from solidifying their unity. And in particular, the past 2-3 years, we've witnessed a very coordinated attack. It began in Europe, really, in Germany last year. But this year, it escalated into unprecedented violence. The perpetrators of these disruptions are really a tiny minority. You saw the festival in Seattle, where thousands of people were gathered, celebrating their culture and unity. The disruptors did not amount to 100 or so, but it was very violent. In some cities, in some occasions in Europe, there were injuries sustained. And in all these events, by the way, the police were informed beforehand that there would be possible disruptions, but the protection was lacking. This is, you can say, it's a pogrom, sort of racist attack on Eritrean culture and identity. The Eritrean organizers were not provoked. As much as possible, they remained peaceful. They remained on the defensive. They abided by the law. They did not go into tit for tat, into senseless violence, because at the end of the day, the perpetrators are, although non-Eritreans, people mostly from neighboring Tigray, adherents or recruits of the ethno-fascist TPLF, which was defeated in Ethiopia. This is a continuation of the blame game on Eritrea and Eritrean identity and culture. From all these festivals that we have witnessed in Germany, in Sweden, in UK, Canada, the US, and the latest manifestation of it being in Israel last weekend. It has been very trying, but on the other hand, the flip side of it is that it has solidified the unity of Eritreans. Eritreans, rise to the occasion, and such attacks and such, hooliganism only strengthen our internal cohesion and unity.
These people who disrupt the festivals, you've said they're from Tigray. Give our listeners a little background to what was happening in the Tigray region of Ethiopia and how that impacted Eritrea in the past few years.
Well, it spans over decades, ever since the TPLF seized power in Ethiopia, tiny minority group which seized power in Ethiopia. At that time, there was collaboration between the Eritrean revolutionaries and the Tigrayan nationalists. So in 1991, they seized power in Ethiopia. But in order to perpetuate their rule in Ethiopia, they devised this very dangerous and toxic ethnic politics that divides Ethiopian society along sectarian ethnic lines. And thus, a tiny minority was able to impose its rule over Ethiopia. Not only that, but they became a proxy for the Western powers, the United States, basically, to impose hegemony over the entire Horn of Africa. So similar attempts of dividing societies along sectarian ethnic lines were tried in Somalia along clan basis. Against Eritrea, a war was launched in 1998, ostensibly under border pretext, but eventually that war was supposed to have been resolved by, the peace agreement and through arbitration court. The Eritrean boundary was clearly demarcated, delimited, but the TPLF was not willing to accept this, so it continued its hostilities against Eritrea for over 2 decades. In Ethiopia, in the meantime, the TPLF faced mounting protest and uprising from the majority of the Ethiopian population. And eventually, in 2018, the Ethiopian people, being fed up of this misrule or misleadership by this tiny ethno-fascist kleptocratic group, overthrew it, essentially, and it was overthrown from power and fled helter-skelter to its home base in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. Now, instead of accepting the will of the people, the TPLF was not willing to abide by the will of the people. And again, they launched another senseless war in 2020, November 2020, with the backing of the US and other Western supporters. This senseless war went on for about 2 years until eventually it was totally defeated and forced to sign the Pretoria Peace Agreement with the Ethiopian government. The war that the TPLF launched in 2020 was two-pronged, one against the central government of Ethiopia and two against Eritrea. They fired tens of rocket missiles at Eritrea in provocation. And so the two governments, having signed peace agreement, first of all, realized that conflagration of war by the TPLF would be dangerous for the entire Horn of Africa. And so they collaborated to contain it, which they did. And eventually, the TPLF was forced to sign the Pretoria Peace Agreement in 2022, November. That is a year ago. This is where we are, unable to accept the reality again. The provocations against Eritrea are continuing in the diaspora through their recruits. Now, many of the disruptors that came to Europe, to the United States, came claiming to be Eritreans. Though they are not from Eritrea, they claimed to be Eritreans because in Europe and the United States, blanket political asylum were being granted for anybody who claims to be from Eritrea.
Under Hillary's leadership, we're doing more than ever with our annual trafficking report, with new outreach and partnerships, to give countries incentives to meet their responsibilities and calling them out when they don't. I recently renewed sanctions on some of the worst abusers, including North Korea and Eritrea. We're partnering with groups that help women and children escape from the grip of their abusers. We're helping other countries step up their own efforts, and we're seeing results.
This was part of the continuing, strategic depopulation of Eritrea of its youth, efforts by the US and its Western allies, along with all the sanctions, isolation, encirclement of Eritrea. All kinds of hostilities were tried. And one part of it was this strategic depopulation in which Eritrean youth were enticed to flee their country, but many also came to Europe, to Israel, to Canada, to America, claiming to be Eritreans. So, in a nutshell, what you saw as attack against Eritrean festivals is a futile continuation of these hostilities against Eritrea by the bankrupt TPLF junta.
This year, these disruptions have gotten some media attention, but even when it does, the media reporting is terrible. One example is from The Guardian, the UK paper, which was once the left paper in the UK. Now it is another government mouthpiece as much as the BBC or the Times or any of those outlets. And they had an article ostensibly about one of the festival disruption, and they didn't bother to interview anybody who organizes these festivals, persons like yourself. And it was just another smear against Eritrea. So even when there is media attention, it is not very good. It's not at all objective, and there's not even an effort to get background on the story.
That's, you hit the nail right on the head, Margaret. It's a classic propaganda ploy of inverting the victim and the aggressor.
Who in the media instigates violence?
There is and has been a vast network of what I would call propaganda disinformation complex that has been working against Eritrea. And these are involved in this, anti-Eritrea propaganda are involved so-called experts, white European mainly, but some Americans also, who pose often as experts of the region, the Horn of Africa, but particularly Eritrea, Ethiopia. Some of them come from the background of BBC correspondents. The most notorious of this is one called Martin Plaut, originally from South Africa. There are others like Miriam van Rijssen from the Netherlands, who has an NGO called EEPA, funded by the European Union. There is the Norwegian Kjetil Tromvold. And let's not forget the Soros-funded International Crisis Group also. There you find a British guy named William Davison, Alex de Waal from Tufts University's Peace Foundation. All in all, I would say the hardcore of these group number about 20, and they have been working in a relentless disinformation propaganda campaign against Eritrea for the past more or less 20 years, 2 decades. Lately, some of them have been openly advocating for violence. Martin Plaut, for example, has been caught on record lecturing to a group of so-called Eritrean oppositions of why it is necessary to go the violence route. He said,
we need to make the news. And this is not as difficult as it sounds, but it is really important. So you're manufacturing the news, but you need to think of the angle. Do not go another demonstration outside the Eritrean embassy unless you're going to burn it down.
Don't do peaceful demonstrations because those kinds don't work unless you're prepared to burn down the embassy in London, the Eritrean embassy, that is. Behind this latest manifestation of violent attacks against Eritrea festivals are really these so-called, some call them conflict entrepreneurs. I call them conflict vultures, really. They have been behind the war in Tigray, giving up propaganda cover for the TPLF, demonizing Eritrea. And let's throw into the mix also, the human rights NGOs, the Trojan horses, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. So this is a vast complex. And sometimes people are also who are former U.S. ambassadors to Ethiopia, such as Tibor Naj or David Shin, who are currently entrenched in the U.S. think tanks, also play a role in this regard. And then there are the media journalists in CNN, New York Times, and what have you, who are oftentimes called to, to assist in this campaign of disinformation and propaganda. Over the past 2 decades, if you examine the record, and a very good document in this regard is one that was put out by the New Africa Institute. That document's title is called Disinformation in Tigray, Manufacturing Consent for the Secessionist War, written by a young Eritrean American, Dr. Simon Tesfamariam. It really breaks down this vast network of so-called experts, conflict entrepreneurs, think tank researchers, and so on and so forth. I forgot to mention also another fellow from America called Dan Connell. They are a group who have been working in concert, who have been campaigning for sanctions to be imposed on Eritrea, for Eritrea to be isolated diplomatically, politically, and what have you, and to assist this latest manifestation of violent attacks against Eritrean identity and Eritrean culture. They work behind the scenes, but sometimes they come to the forefront and expose themselves. These aggressors, this tiny minority of hooligans, perpetrated the violence, illegal violence, were presented as if they were peaceful protesters against the Eritrean government. Oftentimes, the narrative is spanned as in a forced dichotomy of supporters of the government or the regime against the protesters of the regime. Nothing could be further from the truth. These cultural festivals are a celebration of Eritrean unity, of Eritrean culture. It has nothing to do with the government in Eritrea. I mean, true, part of the celebrants, I would say many of them would have strong ties with their homeland. They don't want to see Eritrea being unfairly demonized. They don't want Eritrea to be under economic warfare or so-called sanctions, baby killer sanctions. They are patriotic. They want good for their country. But as I said, these festivals have been going on for decades with no violence. But the Western mainstream media, as you correctly pointed out, spins it as if those violent hooligans are peaceful protesters, protesting the regime, calling for democracy and human rights. What kind of democracy and human rights is it that to beat up children, women, and unarmed civilians? Where is the so-called liberal values of the right to peaceful assembly, the right to your cultural heritage? All these have been exposed to be nothing but bankrupt, empty sermonization. What we've witnessed is that Eritreans are being discriminated, racist attacks, although the perpetrators may be black like us, they're hired hooligans. You see this, for example, we witnessed it in South Africa during the fall of apartheid. There was black on black violence, so-called black on black violence. But we know that, certain sectors of, the apartheid regime did hire some hooligans to attack ANC and the majority black population from their goals, to detract them from their goals. So these kinds of tactics are being used in the Eritrean case. The perpetrators are given all kinds of police protection. They are allowed to rampage. Nothing happens to them. Whereas the peaceful people who gather and who are law-abiding, who have fulfilled everything that is required legally, are portrayed as if they are in the same basket. It's a classic inverting of the victim and aggressor propaganda tactic. And outlets like The Guardian, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the so-called liberal media, liberal left media, have now exposed themselves to be really disseminators of propaganda and lies. That's what we have witnessed in the case of Libya and Syria, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, always the mouthpiece of the imperialist powers that perpetuate these forever wars. The victims are constantly portrayed as being aggressors, and that is what we have witnessed, manifestation of, propaganda, a la a la Goebbels, a la Edward Bernays.
That's absolutely true. These are mouthpieces for the state. They're not legitimate news organizations. And Eritrea, their reporting on Eritrea is emblematic of the way they report on many other parts of the world. And they toe the party line, the state's line. I mean, I read the New York Times every day. I read the Washington Post because I have to know what they're saying. But I'm well aware of the fact that I'm not getting any news, especially about a nation like Eritrea, which the U.S. Has designated as an adversary, as an enemy, as they feel the right to sanction.
Well, this portrayal of these incidents by the mainstream media also is an attack on it. It blemishes the good name of Eritrea. It's demonization, and it doesn't portray the truth on the ground. You have witnessed the festival in Tacoma as other independent journalists like you. To be inside the compound where the festival was being held is to witness people who are proud, who are peaceful, who are progressive, who cherish all the values that should be lauded and applauded. And yet the mainstream media puts it in the same basket, even worse than the hooligans and perpetrators. The hooligans and perpetrators are portrayed as if they are for democracy and human rights and what have you. The end result of this relentless, skewed coverage of the Eritrean festival is the demonization of Eritrea, the scapegoating of Eritrea, him and the aggressor. The investigative journalist John Pilger would call war by media.
Yes, it's war propaganda. Our listeners, where can they find out about your work or find out more about issues involving Eritrea?
I have my own channel on YouTube, Elias Amare. I also, as you said, the editor of Horn of Africa TV, which is on YouTube. I'm active on Twitter at Elias Amare. I'm also on Facebook, although these days the social media is also getting worse and worse by the day, more or less like the propaganda media.
And that was Elias Amare discussing the phenomenon of disruptions of Eritrean festivals.